countries actually trying to do this. And I recall my own initiatives at the beginning when it was a very lonely place. Okay, now it's much more. It remains very difficult, but at least we are together, and we need to be together in mobilizing the international community opinion. The ICJ absolutely needs to be. We need to go there. We need to find some kind of support. It's absolutely correct. As far as we are concerned, justice needs to be addressed here, but we need to work together. I understand that I know that we have one of the Pacific countries who has taken this to the International Court of Justice. It would have been, in my view, it would have been better if we could have been part of the process, part of the initiative, and one or two countries would take it on our behalf as a region. Of course, if we can mobilize the support of other regions, it would be much better. I'm aware that in a couple of years back, the Vanuatu, and of course Ralph is here, he was then foreign minister, who tried to persuade the forum, the Pacific Islands Forum, to take up the case with the ICJ. Yeah, and my question was, why was it not taken up? And it makes me ask some questions, I know from my own personal experience that as a forum, as a grouping, the forum has not always been solid on the issue of climate change. There are times when we have differed quite significantly from our neighboring countries. I remember from my own experience in 2015, when we were trying to consolidate our position to the Paris discussions, that there were countries who could not find themselves to come to agree on 1.5 degrees. They argued that that would be too devastating for their economies, and we had differences. We had the arguments during the retreat, but gladly we were able to come away to Paris with that consolidated position. What I would also like to point out is we can and we need to work beyond the Pacific region. In 2015, we were able to take it to the Commonwealth heads of government, and from there we went directly to Paris, and it was a solid position, and so we need to do that. I think we must never underestimate the need to mobilize support from beyond the region. I see ourselves that working with CARICOM, we should do that, and even the Commonwealth itself. Leading up to Paris, I had the opportunity to visit a number of capitals. So we need to have a better coordinated strategy, using our leaders to visit capitals either alone or together as a team, but it must be part of a regional strategy. We've got to mobilize the international opinion. We've got to visit the capitals, and we need to do that. Okay, why do we continue to not be as successful as we could be? And I think maybe because sometimes within our own ranks, there is not always full agreement on the strategy. So I believe we need to get our leaders to agree on the strategy, which they must be a part of in implementing it. I challenge our regional organizations and beyond to take a much more proactive role in formulating that strategy and actually co-opting leaders who can take the case to other regions, who can take the case to other countries, to argue the case that this is necessary, that the justice needs to be done, and if the way to do it is through the International Court of Justice, so why don't we do that? I will come back to that issue later, but let me answer the second question. What should be the role of the special rapporteur on human rights for Pacific Island nations? There are issues due to the impacts of climate change, which I believe, and perhaps due to their cataclysmic scale, are never fully addressed or directly addressed at the highest international political levels. Massive displacement of people on the front line of climate change, loss of sovereignty and of course, nations, climate change refugees, building long-term climate resilience. There are no precedents in the international discourse and interactions, so we need to address these head-on. We want to continue to remain on our home islands, but the science is very clear that unless we can build the resilience to do so, it will not be possible. Such adaptation measures will require huge resources which small island nations do not possess. The question is, will nations with the resources accept liability for this and foot the bills? They have not done so to date and will become less likely to do so as they begin to realize that their own countries are also vulnerable to climate change. So climate-induced migration is almost certainly our future reality. We will continue. Okay, the question is, which countries will be able to accept our people and on what conditions, on what terms and on what conditions? I've heard some proposals coming forward. I heard the former Prime Minister of Australia saying maybe we should have a compact type agreement with Australia, but we would offer our exclusive economic zones in return. Okay, these are options to be considered, and I think we need to continue to discuss this. These are the human rights issues which definitely need to be addressed, and of course, I hope that the special rapporteur will give consideration to this. But I believe that we must not put everything on all of these heavy lift on the special rapporteur. We must do our own. We must go forward. We must be very active. And I applaud the climate network, climate action network for what it's doing. But we need to put this. We need to inject this kind of mentality, this kind of passion into our leaders, so that we can communicate that passion to other leaders. You know, we must, regardless of what we believe, leadership has a very critical role. And of course, that takes me to the next question. Okay, and if I can do this while I have the opportunity to speak. The next question that we need to address is, what should be the likely call for action? The priority which Pacific Island nations need to rally around at the upcoming COP26. Simply action. Action. We've been talking about all of these things, but we need action because time is running out for us. But in suggesting that, in proposing that, I would like to put forward 2 points. Our Pacific Island leaders need to continue to agree on a strategy. They need to agree on a strategy. And they need to continue to lobby on the basis of that strategy at the capitals, well before COP26, at the next upcoming United Nations General Assembly. This must be a well-coordinated and ongoing strategy involving our leaders. Our leaders must be part of this process. I don't know. From my own experience, I think we've not always taken on board what the NGOs and the civil society has taken. I know for a fact that in some countries, civil society is not really taken on board in its consideration. I was in Australia in a couple of years back, and I remember before the election, climate change was supposed to be one of the critical issues at the top of the agenda during the elections. But of course, as soon as the current government in Australia came in, climate change seemed to have taken the back seat again. Okay, the second point that I need to make, and it's we've got to understand that in undertaking all of these initiatives, these strategies, we've got to truly understand the role and the power of dark money in the whole process. It is no longer a conspiracy theory that the fossil fuel industry has been very active behind the scenes in counteracting any and all of the initiatives that we have taken, that you have taken. And they have the power to do this. They have the power to manipulate. They have the power to influence the institutions that we need to work with, perhaps including I wonder, perhaps including the International Court of Justice. I truly hope not. But how can we not question this when even the biggest, most powerful nation and the model of democracy, the United States, is actually being subjected to the power of dark money? That is not a speculative, it is a fact. And so we need to take this on board in all of the work and the strategy that we are doing, because unless we do so, we will be less than successful. In my own experience, I did not understand how powerful this was. But since leaving office and being involved at a different level, I understand now that our institutions of government, our democracies, are being undermined by the power of dark money. The question is, what is our priority? Action. Action on the challenges that I've already outlined, perhaps in response to the question number 2. Thank you for your attention and all the best to you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Tom. This is a really good segue. I've noted that you have highlighted points like solidarity and consensus, and also that we governments and CSOs should strategize, and IGOs should strategize well before COP. So we'll take that point on board in our minutes for this particular event. And also I'd like to acknowledge once again Kiribati, Tuvalu, and other Pacific Island nations who really fought for the 1.5 degree, and that's something that we are holding the world accountable to today. With that, I would now go into somebody else who has actually been raising the flag high for loss and damage, and now also in the International Court of Justice case, and that's Honorable Ralph Raganvanu from opposition leader from Vanuatu. So please, sir, we'd be delighted to hear what are your views on how the Pacific can collaborate on this issue, and also the priorities going into COP26. Thank you. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Ashwin. I'm honored to be invited to participate in this inaugural Pacific Climate Justice Summit. And I'm very proud to be associated with all the partners in the event and the other distinguished participants because of our collective strength, ambition, unwavering dedication to change the business as usual context that has brought us to this point of human history, which is basically an existential crisis. And in particular, I'd like to pay tribute to His Excellency Untitled Chapter, one of our pioneers in this fight, also Solomon Yeo, one of our key emerging leaders. So we've heard the Honorable Anote talk about international climate negotiations and the success they had in Paris. However, we have made remarkably poor progress in implementing the pledges under Paris. And currently, according to the latest evidence, the latest scientific reports, we are on track for at least 3 degrees Celsius warming by 2100. As we know, this is a scenario that promises environmental devastation, as well as large-scale violations of human rights for the most vulnerable. The reports from the IPCC make it crystal clear there's no way to mitigate climate change without getting rid of coal and oil. We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And yet, what we're seeing right now as we're speaking is the major economies of the world not changing track. They're still building and opening new coal mines and are planning to do so for years to come. They're still building and opening new coal-powered power plants and are planning to do so for years to come. They are still opening new oil wells and building new oil pipelines and are planning to do so for years to come. They continue to resist real climate action, instead denying, offsetting, excluding, outsourcing, and setting vague, distant targets. They continue to provide enormous subsidies to the less than 100 corporations that contribute over 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, while generating for themselves over $80 billion in profits per year. This is the dirty money that Anote was referring to. Rather than taking the obvious path of taxing these dirty energy revenues so they can be used for the alleviation and avoidance of the suffering caused by climate impacts in the developing countries, including our own. So the injustice of climate change is that the impacts are felt first and hardest by those with the least responsibility for its causes. For example, my country, Vanuatu, is on the front lines of climate change, and yet we have benefited least from the exploitation of fossil fuels that has caused it. The cost of climate protection and adaptation projects run to many billions of dollars and far exceed our public resources. For example, due to a single tropical cyclone in 2015, Vanuatu lost 64.1% of its GDP. That is total economic loss and damage impacts of almost $500 million US. The Vanuatu Green Climate Fund urgent project pipeline requirements top $700 million US, but with our nearest developed country neighbor in the Pacific refusing to replenish the GCF, I seriously doubt that any of the critical interventions we need to provide finance for our most vulnerable people will ever see the light of day. So in this gloomy context, what choice do we have? Firstly, to make sure there is real, concrete, urgent action on emissions reduction. And secondly, to make sure we have the level of finance we need to adapt, mitigate, and compensate for loss and damage in a way that minimizes any negative effect on human rights and stops the abuses of nature. How can we shift the obligation and the costs of climate protection back onto the fossil fuel companies, the financial institutions, and the governments that actively and knowingly created this existential threat in our countries? How can we assure the reform of global institutions, including financial institutions, proper funding of the Green Climate Fund, comprehensive debt relief, stronger taxation regulation of the fossil fuel sector, for example, a climate damages tax, and other controversial measures, controversial in inverted commas, that create equitable wealth distribution, as has been advocated, for example, by the UN Secretary General? And how do we think we can do more to push these measures to fruition? We have been talking, negotiating, pleading, protesting, but are we getting anywhere? If we're not getting what the response we want by asking, maybe it's our role as leaders to lead the charge and explore other avenues to get what we want. What we are seeing now across the world are people using the avenue of utilizing the judicial system in various jurisdictions, including under international law, to shift the imperative and the cost of climate protection back onto the fossil fuel companies, the financial institutions, and the governments that actively and knowingly created this existential threat to our people. And we are seeing these measures having success. Just in the last year, we've seen many cases won on these issues against governments, against corporations. The single best measure which will strengthen this course of action, which is legal action, is an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. An ICJ advisory opinion would establish clear markers of state duty and clarify and accelerate state action towards effective and equitable solutions to climate change. By really setting out clearly what the legal obligations of states are concerning climate change, such an opinion would be a powerful way to operationalize what we agreed on in Paris about the urgency of climate action. Indeed, the lack of clarity around state duties is what has hobbled the collective efforts of the international community to respond effectively to the climate crisis. An ICJ advisory opinion will also constitute an independent, authoritative assessment of the adequacy of actual and pledged climate action to date. As I said, we're on track for 3 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, which is a catastrophe. The court can establish clear standards based on science and the rule of law, a sharp contrast with the lowest common denominator needed to establish consensus in climate negotiations. An ICJ advisory opinion will also help, not hinder, climate negotiations by providing a clear legal framework for all countries to follow. The process would necessarily start with the adoption of a UN General Assembly resolution, clarifying that state discretion to determine the levels of ambition or the level of the financial assistance they're going to be giving to developing countries is confined by their legal obligations. And the precise scope of these obligations would be discussed as part of the process of written and oral submissions to the court, which all countries would be invited to provide. The court would be able to resolve any ambiguity well before countries are due to submit their second NDCs in 2025. Thus, the process will enable all countries to bring their individual and collective climate action in line with legal standards as expediently as possible without undermining the negotiation process. An ICJ advisory opinion would also provide a much needed baseline for the purpose of achieving climate justice, including litigation. And I've talked a bit about that. An advisory opinion would also address the practical fact that the greatest threats to climate negotiations, as Anote said, are political. The elucidation of international law through such an opinion would bolster the capacity of the international legal system to withstand these political threats. Indeed, a definitive statement of legal principles in this area will allow states to more effectively meet their international obligations under the climate change regime. So I want to acknowledge that there's been past attempts to bring the question of climate change to the ICJ for an advisory opinion. The first attempt was by Palau, with the support of other Pacific Island states in 2011. While Palau managed to build a more than 30-member coalition, the initiative was effectively ended by the United States, which reportedly threatened to cut off all certain monetary aid to Palau to continue with the effort. The idea of seeking an ICJ advisory opinion, which is now before us, formally resurfaced in 2019 thanks to the efforts of a group of law students from the USP, the Pacific Islands Students Fighting Climate Change, who are also a partner in this summit. In June 2019, the Pacific Islands Students Fighting Climate Change wrote to the Pacific heads of state, urging them to seek an ICJ advisory opinion on climate change. In August 2019, 2 months later, the Pacific Island Forum leaders meeting in Tuvalu, Vanuatu resolved to place the initiative on the official agenda. And as Anote said, we called on Pacific Island Forum leaders to support it. While the leaders communicated that came out of Tuvalu fall short of actually endorsing the initiative, it includes the following paragraph. In recognizing the need to formally secure the future of our people in the face of climate change and its impacts, leaders noted the proposal for a UN General Assembly resolution seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the obligations of states under international law to protect the rights of present and future generations against the adverse effects of climate change. So that was the resolution that came out of the 2019 Pacific Island Forum Leaders Summit. In September 2019, in the margins of the Climate Action Summit convened by the UN Secretary General in New York, Vanuatu convened a closed-door diplomatic effort to discuss the initiative with representatives of like-minded countries. We have also taken further steps at the domestic level to continue leadership on this initiative, including the establishment of Climate Loss and Damage Legal Task Force, which was effectively set up in January this year. And our National Advisory Board on Climate Change, NAB, endorsed this initiative in February. So my big hope is that at the upcoming PIF leaders meeting hosted by Fiji, as Anote says, Pacific leaders will unite and resolve to support this initiative unambiguously and use their networks to lobby both as a bloc and unilaterally for the support of other countries for this resolution. And this is my opinion on what is the most effective way for Pacific nations to collaborate and express support for the ICJ advisory opinion. In terms of the key call to action that I would like to see championed by the Pacific delegation in the lead up to COP26, it's the support for this resolution at the UN General Assembly. If the Pacific unites behind this action, it's possible we can get this resolution before the UN General Assembly in the next 12 months. And the ICJ advisory opinion could be another 12 months after that. And as I've said, that will be a key thing, a key plank of climate action, which we can start to see some results from. So I want to thank you for having me to talk about this at this summit.
Winakavakelevu, Honorable Raganvanu. That's fantastic. And I'm happily noting that there is a call out to the PIF for their support and unity amongst the Pacific Island nations to once again try a united effort on this particularly legalistic issue, which you said Palau couldn't push through in the past. So taking note of that from this summit, and also thanking you very much for holding the fort and taking this issue to another level in the past year or so. And there's a lot of international recognition now that there is this particular case in question. And it's a new trend, I must say, from the region, but also from many other countries who are now trying to seek legal action and damages from various courts. With that, we would take a little pause now and look at an animation that's relevant to this particular discussion. And in that time, I let people digest everything that they've heard. And I have taken note of the questions that came into the chat. We will address them in the second part of the session after our speakers have finished. So don't worry, I'm taking note of them, and you can also send it to me personally. We will look at them in the discussion session. So I'll let the MC and the team bring in the animation that they would like to share with us.
In every year of the last decade, our world has seen greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise and shatter records. But those responsible for burning the most fossil fuels have not experienced the most direct consequences of climate change. It has been us. The hundreds of millions of people living on the front line of the climate crisis. If global temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius in my lifetime, countries like mine will vanish beneath the waves. I will be forced to leave the land where my ancestors are buried, and to tell my children they have nowhere to call home. At Rio de Janeiro, Kyoto, and later at Paris, we were promised action. But despite ever more opportunities to address this crisis, the planet is hurtling towards climate catastrophe. Existing international agreements have not provided countries with legal clarity on their responsibilities to reduce emissions, leading to inaction. To break the impasse, the UN General Assembly must request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change and human rights. All it would take is a simple majority vote from UN member states. An advisory opinion is not legally binding but carries great legal and moral authority, encouraging all nations to protect the human rights of people affected by climate change. An opinion from the highest court in the world would also help to build a critical global coalition uniting governments and international institutions, and would define exactly what existing bodies of laws nations should follow. In the past, advisory opinions have been instrumental in establishing international laws on the right to self-determination, the prevention of genocide, and nuclear disarmament. We believe it could do the same for climate change. A planet in crisis doesn't have to be our future. If there is power in the world to save humanity from environmental disaster, it is the power of the people. But time is running out, and we have to act now. Please visit our website to join us.
Sorry, the Vina Kavakalevu for that video, and I'd like to invite our next speaker, which is, I'm very excited about that because this is our only female speaker apart from me. So thank you for being here, Honorable Hilda Lini. And this person doesn't need too much introduction because she's an amazing, amazing person who's been out there in the scene fighting for justice and gender justice particularly as well, and being out there doing activism from a very long time, and we owe this spirit of activism to her in the Pacific. So with that, I'd like to invite Honorable Hilda Lini to please give us some insight on what do you think about this issue, and in terms of how do you think the Pacific will change?
I would like to acknowledge the universe and our spiritual custodians of the Pacific region, land and sea and sky, the species that sustain us, and the ancestors and elders of this particular island. From mine and my very warm greetings to you all. Pacific communities are at the has reached a critical stage. And our Pacific governments must stand together for the sake of our survival. Shamim Khan, as Fiji's permanent representative at the UN, with her experience in human rights, I believe she is better placed to coordinate the Pacific efforts, as well as the process of appointing the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Justice. The idea of requesting International Court of Justice advisory opinion is a case of human rights and climate justice for Pacific survival. I can only share my own experience on the process we followed in Union on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. It began with civil society organizations, one government, Vanuatu, the Pacific governments, and we mobilized the governments of the whole world, and I call it a success. At that time, Pacific people had been speaking out against the way the Pacific region was being used and abused by nuclear issue. Everyone in the Pacific region were against nuclear activity. Nuclear free and independent Pacific led the Pacific Conference of Churches, the women's conferences, labor unions, students' unions. They were all against this colonial attitude. It is important to note that New Zealand individuals and anti-nuclear civil society organizations initiated the World Court Project. It was adopted by the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Conference, which I was part of. Activist, and at that time, a member of Vanuatu Parliament and Minister of Health. When I received a letter from an elder citizen of New Zealand who asked if I would sponsor a resolution at the World Health Assembly to ban the use of nuclear bombs. His reasoning was that Vanuatu was a strong advocate against nuclear tests in the Pacific, and against the use of nuclear weapons, and it had declared itself a nuclear-free state. I believe nuclear-free is a human right, and nuclear-free zones is for humanitarian reasons. I felt obliged to sponsor the resolution for the cause of humanity. I then responded positively to the elder. Vanuatu sponsored a resolution at the World Health Assembly, a process that resulted in the landmark International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the question, is the threat or use of nuclear weapons in any circumstances permitted under international law? At the World Health Assembly, dialogue on the draft resolution began. The first to ban nuclear weapons in a state of ship. The delegate read the resolution. The resolution reads, seeking the advisory opinion from ICJ, and he helped finalize the wordings. India's input was important because other delegates who declined at the first approach were now coming forward to co-sponsor. With acceptable wording and the resolution, we began mobilizing co-sponsors from the Pacific, the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, Arab states, and Asia. There were 20. There was one sponsor and 20 co-sponsors.
Our team is trying to resolve the technical issue and just replace the laptop. Please unmute yourself, Honorable Lini. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Voting on the resolution was successful, and 2 counter resolutions by nuclear powers were both defeated. Australia and New Zealand, however, were not co-sponsors. They stood together with the nuclear powers. Reached in the International Court of Justice, government in 1994 to lobby. I briefed the Vanuatu ambassador on the successful passage of the Vanuatu-sponsored resolution at the World Health Assembly in Geneva, and now the upcoming resolution at UNGA to effect the passage to the ICJ. He happened to be chair of Pacific ambassadors in New York, so he knew what to do. Vanuatu invited 45 ambassadors to a luncheon where I presented the resolution to seek support for the resolution at the UN General Assembly. Vanuatu Mission arranged for me to speak at a meeting of the Group of 77 and at a meeting of the Non-Aligned Movement. UNGA adopted resolution 49/7 on 15th December 1994 and submitted it to the International Court for advisory opinion. In October and November of 1996, ICJ deliberated on the case. 20 governments, including 3 Pacific Islands, Solomon Islands, Samoa, and Nauru, filed written statements and 2 observations and 2 observations. 22 governments presented oral statements. There were 6 charges, and the ICJ and the advisory opinion was decided on 8th July 1996, which has celebrated the 25th anniversary of the advisory opinion. The official process took 4 years. Today, no country can use nuclear weapons because of this International Court of Justice advisory opinion. Lobbying for a political question, such as nuclear weapons, needs personal political will, commitment, patience, intelligence, and most important is diplomacy. Lobbying for commitment to international justice will probably be easier. I would like to suggest that we continue with the idea of seeking International Court of Justice advisory opinion. We need solidarity on Paris Agreement at COP26. And we as civil society need to stand together and mobilize our governments of the Pacific to stand together so that we can mobilize governance of the world. My only encouragement is always to be strong and very clear in what we are seeking from International Court of Justice for the advisory opinion. I hope I did not bore you with the process when it began as a civil society initiative in early 1990s, then went through the WHA in 1993, then through the UNGA in 1994, and finally, the International Court of Justice in 1995 and 1996. I wish you every success in whatever you do. Thank you.
Really amazing. Vinaka Vakelevu. So as Chief of Turanga Nation, Honorable Lini has really taken us through a storytelling process, and in fact, really taken this, in English we'd say a case study, but this was really a talanoa and a storytelling where she has given us a full overview of how this was done in the past, and used the example of the World Health Assembly case study to show us that this is possible, and to show us that this is what we are doing is not only for the Pacific, but actually for the rest of the world as well. And I'm sure our fellow Global South colleagues and countries who are also fighting similar issues of climate justice and climate migration, climate-related migration in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, they will one day thank the Pacific Island leaders for coming together, and the Pacific Island civil society for coming together and planting these particular seeds of taking the issue to the ICJ. So with that, let's transfer into another generation, and I would like to invite Solomon Law, who actually is part of the youth initiative that gave birth to this whole process and then brought it to the government level, etc. If I understand right, that was the story. But tell me, Solomon, what was the story and how would you see this campaign now amplified and supported going into COP26? And also, so Solomon Law is the campaign director of the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change. Welcome, and I'm really happy to see how we are transferring into intergenerational spaces. And over to you, Solomon.
Thank you too much, Ashwini. And first and foremost, good fellow morning from Solomon Islands. And before my intervention today, I would really like to, of course, acknowledge the organizers and today's facilitator.
Can I ask people to please mute everybody to mute except for Solomon so that we can hear him clearly? Thank you very much. Please put yourselves on mute, Vinaka.
Okay. To everyone who is tuning in from all over the region and of course the world, and to a co-panelist, Excellency Anote Tong, for your dedication and sacrifice you have made truly out of necessity on raising the global awareness on the adverse effects of climate change and setting forth a high standard for Pacific climate activism. We guarantee you for today, we assure you and guarantee you today that we are behind you and you are no longer alone in this fight. Excellency Hilda Lini, for your bravery beyond comprehension to rise to the challenge, to challenge powerful nuclear states and actors in your instrumental role in the successful 1996 nuclear weapons advisory opinion. To the Honorable Ralph Reganvanu, your commendable leadership on climate justice that you have proven in outstanding length, but above all, your compassionate support and trust towards young people. And last but not least, to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Environment and Human Rights, Dr. David Boyd, for your vision and tirelessly advocacy for everyone who have the right to live in a safe, clean, and healthy and sustainable environment. Today in my intervention, I'll be sharing with you more stories from the ongoing Pacific campaign to seek an advisory opinion at the International Court of Justice. Here onwards, I will be referring to as the ICJAO campaign. So in a nutshell, the ICJAO is the ICJ is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations and is the world's highest court. It basically has two primary functions. One is contentious case, where ICJ can hear disputes from states. And second is to give advisory opinions, which will be one of the main focuses of this session. And perhaps I would like to explain a bit. The best way I found to explain the whole campaign is to draw an analogy to our traditional societies here in the Pacific. And generally speaking, in times of great peril and confusion, villagers often turn to the advice of a person that possesses extensive knowledge and experience for guidance. This could be your local village chief, where villagers upon request can receive a comprehensive advice from. Now, the advisory opinion, like advisory opinions, villagers do not have to follow and can opt to disregard the chief's advice. However, as the highest and wisest authoritative figure in the village, the chief's advice carries great moral and legal weight behind that will bring great clarity to the issue at hand. Villagers would now have greater understanding on the obligations and the sense of direction to advance forward beyond the issue. As highlighted repeatedly throughout yesterday's session, the adverse effects of climate change are heightening to new extremes and are continuing to undermine the full enjoyment of our basic human rights to water and sanitation, food, health, just to name a few of them. Yet global responses to address the climate crisis are moving very, very slowly. It is to this understanding that in 2019, alongside 26 law students from the University of South Pacific, we took the proposal to the leaders of the 18 member states of the Pacific Island Forum to pursue a United Nations General Assembly resolution on the ICJAO campaign on climate change. I vividly remember when we got together and dressed to the nines and nervously presented the proposal to then Honorable Ralph Regan-Vanu, who was the Foreign Affairs Minister of Vanuatu. He kindly welcomed the initiative and also even more kinder agreed to take a selfie with us as well afterwards. The proposal then was taken forward by the Vanuatu government, who resolved to include it in the official agenda of the forum. Although it was noted positively by the leaders, it has yet to be endorsed by the forum leaders. And because of COVID-19, the region came almost to a standstill on climate-related issues. Now, the question that we hope that our leaders could ask the ICJ was on whether states have an obligation to protect the rights of the current and future generation from the adverse effects of climate change. The ICJ, when answering this question in the positives, could cement the connection between human rights and climate change, which is the focus of the overall theme of this session today, or this event. Not limited to, it would enhance states and non-state actors on their efforts to tackle climate change through a rights-based approach. Additionally, it could help strengthen Pacific's and other vulnerable state negotiation position, especially in COPs, by consolidating the specific obligations of developed states to assist developing states on climate action through finance, technology transfer, and capacity building for mitigation, adaptation, and addressing loss and damage. And more importantly, it could be the opportunity for the ICJ to consider the issues of utmost importance to the Pacific, as highlighted by His Excellency Anote Tong, climate-induced displacement and the loss of our territory. The road to ICJ has many twists and turns. Nevertheless, it is a platform for the voices of the marginalized countries and people to inherently influence global affairs and to level the unfavorable playing field that has been so long dominated by the same small roster of powerful states. It is also worth noting that since the beginning, the youth campaign recognizes the key ingredient towards addressing climate crisis is through global cooperation, emphasizing the point Honorable Ralph Regan-Vanu has mentioned, that the ICJAO on human rights and climate change seeks only to complement negotiation and climate action throughout the world. it was never intended or will seek to undermine them. Like a chief's advice, it merely seeks to clarify what needs to be done and how it can be done. To wrap up, the Pacific and other climate vulnerable states have yet to take full advantage of the tools available in the international stage, with the ICJAO campaign being the one. That being said, what is the next step for the choir? Although there is interest in the region, a key step is yet to be taken. That is, the leaders of the Pacific Island Forum must resolve to endorse the ICJAO campaign, form a coalition, and then lead the charge into the international arena, initiating the process to take the biggest problem of the world today to the highest court in the world. And finally, when appearing before the court, states must not abandon the voices of those who stand to lose the most in the climate crisis, who is the young people, who some of you have witnessed through the music video, is shouting in the Solomon Islands dialect, less fata, more leka, which loosely translated, less talk, more action. I thank you all for allowing this opportunity to speak to you today. Big fala tage tumas.
Thank you so much, Solomon. Really appreciate that. And also bringing in the voice of the young people while we have heard from our elders, and to see what's happening and how the youth organizations are taking on this challenge on climate justice. So thank you. And thanks for being with us. With this, I will actually invite our MC or the technical team to actually share a video that we have from our last speaker. It's a very short video, and after that we are going to have a half-an-hour session where we can discuss and actually address some of the questions that have been raised, and also pose questions to our speakers and have a bit of interaction. So bear with us, grab a drink, a warm one or a cold one to keep us going, and we will listen now to, we are listening to David Boyle. Yes, we're listening to David Boyle, who has been the former rapporteur, and he is going to share his views on the questions that I have posed earlier. So over to the technical team.
Hello, I'm Dr. David Boyd, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and I'm really delighted to be joining you today as part of the Pacific Climate Justice Summit. I'm also a Pacific Islander here on the west coast of Canada, where we've been enduring an unbelievable heat wave, drought, wildfires. 2 weeks ago, temperatures reached almost 50 degrees Celsius, which is just unprecedented in Canadian history. So this is clear evidence that we are living in a climate emergency. And of course, 2 years ago, when I traveled to Fiji, I witnessed firsthand the devastating impacts of climate change on the people of Fiji from Tropical Cyclone Winston. So that is one of the reasons why I am incredibly supportive of the campaign to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. This could be a really powerful action that could provide clarity around state obligations related to climate change, be a catalyst for accelerated action to deal with climate change in all categories: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. The International Court of Justice, as the world's highest court, could also make clear the obligations of wealthy countries to provide finance to small island developing states and low-income countries. So there are a range of potential benefits from a potential advisory opinion, and I wish you the very best of luck in your efforts to secure that. The second topic that I understand will be part of your discussions is the proposal for a new special rapporteur on climate change and human rights. And I just want to be clear, I have made climate change and human rights one of my top priorities as special rapporteur in the past 3 years. I did a thematic report on this topic, which I presented to the UN General Assembly 2 years ago. Climate change was the key driver in my decision to visit Fiji and to visit Norway for official country missions. I have filed amicus curiae briefs in international and domestic lawsuits involving climate change and human rights in at least 7 cases now around the world. I've sent letters to every government in the world urging them to take a rights-based approach to climate action through their nationally determined contributions. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I've attended the pre-conference of the parties to the previous COP in Costa Rica, where I was a speaker at the closing plenary. I attended COP25 in Madrid. I'll be attending COP26 in Glasgow, if the pandemic permits. I'm currently preparing a briefing note on loss and damages, which endorses the proposals from the Maldives, the Marshall Islands, and other small island states to have air travel levies and shipping levies to raise money for adaptation and loss and damages. And so I'm doing everything in my power. I could use some more resources. And I do believe that because of the global climate emergency, there should be more resources dedicated at all levels of the United Nations to addressing climate change and human rights. I wish you a very interesting and provocative conversation during the Pacific Climate Justice Summit, and I look forward to working together with you in the future. Thank you for everything you're doing for people and this beautiful planet that we all share. Take care.
Thanks to Dr. Boyd for sharing this video. And indeed, he raised the point that climate emergency means not only the Pacific Islands, but actually other parts of the world are now also facing quite drastic impacts and realizing that what the Pacific Islanders have been saying for a long, long time is a reality in everybody's backyard. And that's going to make everybody recognize why this particular case on climate justice is so important and is going to give a lot of leverage when we go to COP26. With that, I would like our technical folks to kindly bring all our speakers, pin them here so that I can open the session on Q&A. I have some questions here already posted to me, and I would like to pose those to our speakers and also see who would like to respond to that first. And if people would like to question or ask the question directly, please put your hands up. We will monitor the hands or put a note in the chat that you'd like to speak. So the first question I have here is, who is going to take the lead on developing a Pacific climate diplomacy strategy? And should that be one of the IGOs like PIPS or SPRAP, or should it be the CSOs or a country that should lead on it? So if there is any suggestions from the speakers in terms of who should lead on the diplomacy strategy going into COP26. Over to you, if anybody would like to take that question first amongst our speakers. I see Honorable Tong having a very, very good smile. He's ready to respond. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to go back to my experience on this issue. And what I found when I was trying to talk to the international community, to talk to the world about the perils of climate change, I was actually looking around for who else might back me. And I think in the back of my mind, I was looking for maybe the Pacific Island Forum to step forward and say, can we work together with you? Can we mobilize the other leaders to come together to do that? No, it didn't happen. And I think that the Pacific Island Forum has that responsibility. In fact, the Pacific Islands Development Program, PIDF, the Pacific Islands Development Forum, was very instrumental in the early stages in actually passing on the buck to the Pacific Islands. So I think we've got to depend, and I think the IF has got to understand that it must not always wait for the leaders to tell them what to do. If they know that the message is common, that it's about the people, it's about the entire region, they need to be able to be more proactive and maybe talk to the leaders rather than wait for the leaders to say, we need to place this on the agenda. But then, of course, I am concerned about what happened with the Vanuatu initiative. asking for that initiative to be put on the forum agenda, and it was actually relegated. My question is, and I'm very much a conspiracy theorist. Why was it that the forum was not able to take it on board? Were there forces within the forum that mitigated against it being done? That is the question. And I must admit that I've not been able to be fully, that question has never been fully resolved. I think the forum has that responsibility, but I think also I see the role of civil society, civil NGOs to push the forum through their own governments. And I hope you have, NGOs have good relationship with their governments, because the NGOs are much more passionate. I know that for a fact. And governments are too busy sometimes, and they might also be subject to lobbying. I know that also for a fact. And so we need to be focused on the agenda. What is the issue for our people? Not necessarily the government, but for our people. And as a government, we need to be able to look after the interests of our people. And I think here I'm asking the institutions that are there to be more compassionate to what it is that the people need to be taken care of. Let me stop there because I think I'm getting into dangerous territory. Thank you.
I'll give a few minutes if Honorable Vanu or Honorable Lini wants to come in on that question about how to collaborate on this issue and who should lead the strategy, diplomatic strategy for the Pacific going into COP26.
So if I may, the issue is that the resolution at the UN General Assembly will require the support of over half of states and more likely 2/3 of states. So as a Pacific Island country, going forward with the resolution without the support of the region doesn't make any sense at all. So it's got to come out of the Pacific Islands Forum, which is why we targeted the forum. That is the highest level forum for the Pacific Islands as a region. And so the Pacific Islands Forum has got to show leadership and step up, and it's make this resolution something they all campaign on, both as a bloc and unilaterally with their network. And that is the way forward for this. And that is something that I think, we need to continue to push the leaders to have this resolution adopted and supported by all the Pacific Island Forum members. Because then immediately after that, then we start to talk to IOSIS, we start to talk to the other SIDS countries, we start building these alliances, even ACP, African Union, and bring all the players on board, the groups, because that's how we're going to get the numbers we need to get the resolution through. So the leadership really has to come from the Pacific Island Forum, and civil society continues to need to push very hard to make sure it happens.
Vinaka for that. Before I go on to my second question, I just want to remind people to please post on the chat or put your hands up or indicate on the chat that you would like to speak, because I would be happy to have another person ask a question if you may like to. I would like to pose this one now, the second question that came in the chat, which is going a bit beyond the strategizing, and it's talking about regionalism, and maybe Honorable Lini, you could take this question first. And that is about how can we strengthen Pacific regionalism on this fight against climate change and its impacts. So how to strengthen regional work and the spirit of regionalism.
Thank you very much. When we realized with the International Court of Justice case that we took, when we realized that the Pacific was slow, we used the international community. So the International Peace Bureau, the Peace Edge Foundation, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, PACWASH, which is Engineers for Against Nuclear War, and the International Lawyers Against Nuclear War. We used those networks because they were able to talk to their governments. When we found that Pacific was scared and they were they were intimidated by Australia and New Zealand because they did not support the resolution. That's why we went to the international community, the NGOs and the civil society, so that they also were able to talk to their. But for Vanuatu, for us, it was the Vanuatu ambassador that I spoke to. He took the leading role as an ambassador because, as Ralph Regervanu said, the UNGA needs majority vote of the governments. Our role as NGO was only in the lobbying outside. We only lobbied outside. But when we got to the inside, whether it was World Health Assembly or UN General Assembly, it was the governments who were the main players. So it's very important that we get the government involved at this stage so that we know who is taking a lead. We could find out who is the government that's that would take our case, the government in the Pacific, and then we could work on with that government to take the case up further to the Pacific Island governments. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And does any of our other speakers want to come on that point on regionalism before we go on to our next question? Okay, I move on to, I see there is a hand, and that's Mahendra Kumar. Please go ahead, Mahendra. He has been in some of those negotiations with great experience as well. Please go ahead, you can unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Ashwini, and thank you to the speakers for great presentations. Just a comment initially. President Tong talked about the PIDF. In fact, I was privileged to be at PIDF during 2015 when President Tong and many others, Prime Minister Sopoanga, the late Tony de Broom, and other Pacific delegations basically realized the shortcomings of a forum statement and took the initiative to get this Suva Declaration on Climate Change, which really was the thing about PIDF, which I wanted to allude to, was the PIDF had the NGOs and the civil society as integral components. So, you know, we had in the big whole, the civil society, the governments, the business sector, everybody sat together and agreed to this powerful statement, which I think was really the rallying call for the Pacific during the Paris meetings. Interestingly, the PIDF, as we all know, was set up by Fiji initially due to circumstances we're all aware of. Of course, we have now come around a full circle, and the Fiji is now the chair of the Pacific Islands Forum. My question to the panel, to any observations, is, I mean, is it not perhaps would be timely for Fiji to take this leadership and the opportunity, being the chairman or chair of the Pacific Islands Forum, and proceed with these sorts of resolutions with Honorable Regervanu and Tong and Ms. Lini are talking about, perhaps firstly to get the regional statement, a more powerful statement, which will go to all sorts of forums like the United Nations General Assembly and of course to the Glasgow Summit. Because right now, it seems to me that we do not really have that sort of common understandings on, we all sort of talk about different issues which we coming from different areas, but not a combined sort of solid statement which all the leaders can back and then take it forward as has been suggested. So my question really is, what are the, does this really present an opportunity? And given Fiji's record or claim to be one of the climate leaders, I'm sure they could be persuaded to take on a much more dominant role in this activity. Thank you.
Over to the panel. Yes, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Fiji has the label as the climate change champion of the region. And so this is definitely something they should take up as chair of the forum. And we hope that that's what will happen. We have the Leaders Summit coming up this week. So I call on Fiji to take up the baton and make sure this resolution is passed at the Leaders Summit.
Any other comments from the speakers?
If I may add to that, I am in total agreement. I think the problem has been that we've all agreed that climate change is an issue, but it's one of those things that everybody agrees to do, but nobody does anything about it because everybody thinks somebody's going to do something about it. It's a classical. And this is where I believe the forum needs to take a much more active role. And I think it should be established procedure that the chair of the forum, as it revolves, should have the task of taking it at every opportunity. If I might add that there was actually a suggestion by leaders, a very informal suggestion off the table, and I remember it being discussed, that maybe we need, the Pacific needs a special envoy for climate change for the region. Okay, and this would provide the ongoing legwork, which would feed in and keep the momentum going because leaders are busy. I understand that, and I know that leaders cannot focus on doing this year after year. Okay, and there might be merit in that idea. I know at the United Nations level we have the UN's journalism, the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy on Oceans. Okay. That agenda was actually driven by the Pacific Island countries. And so we need to do the same thing. I know that within the UN system, perhaps they have somebody like that, but we need somebody in the region who knows exactly what's at stake, who knows what the feeling is within the region, and can move forward with the passion and the absolute commitment because the future of people are at stake. Our people are at stake. Maybe there might be merit in pursuing that informal option. Thank you.
Please go ahead, Honorable Lini.
That governments usually wait for the approach by whoever is concerned on the issue. If it is not with them, then it has to be taken up to them before they take it up. So I'm just wondering whether in this case, climate change, Fiji is the champion, but it might help if Vanuatu, Honorable Ralph, for example, makes an approach to to Fiji to remind them of the responsibility on climate justice, and then they can take it up from there. But also, it is with the civil society in Vanuatu and in Fiji. Fiji should, Bianco is there, and they should meet with the chairman of the forum to say what is the stand of the NGOs at the moment and what we are heading to. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to just invite a last question. If there is one more question, we'll take that before we wrap up. So from George, would an advisory opinion potentially lead to an amendment of the Rome Statute to possibly include ecocide as a crime against humanity? Anyone would like to take that question?
Okay, I'll start. Yes, the advisory opinion would assist that effort, and that effort is already underway in The Hague. There is a different initiative, not this one, which is about getting ecocide included as a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute. And an important development in that is that a definition was just agreed upon, I think, last month. And there was a very important step forward in that campaign. And definitely having an advisory opinion, which does say that states have an obligation under international law to prevent destruction of the environment, to prevent climate change, will obviously will be very supportive of that effort that's underway at present with the state parties to the Rome Charter. Thank you.
There was a follow-up question saying, how long might that take if we were to make such an initiative or the reform? How long would that take?
It really comes down to political will and having the right people in the right place. And I think one of the unfortunate things about this current campaign is I was leading it as part of a government which lost power beginning of last year, and the new government has been very slow to come on board, and that's really delayed a lot of this. So it really depends on the people who are the leaders in the region at the moment. I'm very happy to see Fiame come on as Prime Minister of Samoa. I think she will show some leadership on this issue, but really it depends on that. And I look forward to seeing what comes out of the leaders meeting this week, whether they will bring this agenda item, which was already a part of the resolution 2 years ago in Tuvalu, and elevate it to the next level. We really need to wait and see, but the timing very much depends on those kind of things. I think once the political will is in place, everything else is already there. The technical advice we need is in place. We've been consulting with lawyers all around the world. We know we've sort of identified a question, which is the key, clear kind of issue of contention, was what question was going to be asked of the ICJ. Through a process of working on this issue for over a year, we have really come down to some sort of consensus among the legal experts. And so the technical issues are not the problem. It's really a matter of political leadership, political will. And if it came from the Pacific, I think just like previous initiatives, including 1.5, it could go all the way. But there needs to be, as Anatole Tong said right at the beginning of this session, there needs to be regional solidarity on this issue.
Thank you. And I would like to invite now Mr. Lowe, because you didn't speak much. So I would like to give you the floor for a closing statement, probably anything short that you'd like to share before we finish. And if there is a one-liner or one motivational word that our other speakers want to leave everybody with, I would like you to think about that while Solomon Lowe is speaking to us, and then we would end with that. So over to you.
Yes, thank you, Ashwini, the co-panelists. I think what has been said is really important, and Ada has really clarified the ways going forward. I think for the what I just would like to add on to that is that the youth and the civil society have been doing this, playing their part for almost 3 years now, and I think it's a really long wait. And I believe that the leaders must really consider this matter. There's been really the hard work of young people and civil society in the region are put together to really try to influence the political stalemate that we are at in the global level. It's really important that we have continued to raise the voice, and we will be doing that, of course, from the back. But it's to our leaders that really needs to take the action, and hopefully in this upcoming leaders forum or the next or other international or other regional forums, they can really seek to resolve the issue and take it forward onwards. And also, more specifically, we also encourage our metropolitan states, Australia and New Zealand, to really get on board, because this is where it is most important that their support will be crucial, given their track record internationally, and also the ability to play that bigger role of a brother or a big brother to the Pacific nations, and to form be the glue that holds together all the Pacific Island states together in the coalition that will be move forward out of the region. So that being said, that is just one final closing remarks from myself.
Thank you for that. And one word from all our panelists. We'll start with, let's go with Honorable Lini. What's the word you'd like to leave the listeners with? We have like over 100 people listening and have been following, and nobody dropped off. I'm really impressed. Thanks everyone for hanging in there. So here's the word of inspiration. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. To be positive in our campaign and lobbying, and leave the challenges and the whatever, leave it behind, because in this campaign there is so much victimizing, and you have to be positive all the time.
Stay positive, Vinaka. Over to Honorable Tom.
Thank you. You know, I'm trying to communicate my own experience and feelings in having been involved with this for almost the last 2 decades. And I want to congratulate the Climate Action Network for being so consistent, for being such a nuisance, for being so disruptive, continue being disruptive, all right? Because we have to change the rules. The rules are so set against us. And so we need to get under that. That's always been my, I talk a lot to young people and I say, you know, it's your world. You've got to change the rules, play by your rules. And so Mr. Yo, yes, please do that. And I welcome the participation of the young people. The last thing we must not do is to give up. And I can share with you my own feelings. I'll be 70 very soon, and there are times when I say, no, I'm wasting my time. We're well past the it's too late. But we cannot stop doing that. The reason is because the alternative is simply not acceptable. And we have to continue to fight. We've got to find ways, maybe, as I said, change the rules. We cannot keep knocking on the doors that are locked against us. Let's find new openings. Even blow up new openings if we need to do that. But we are against very powerful forces, and we must understand that. But let us never, ever give up. Thank you.
So don't stop. Over to Honorable Rengan.
Just to say, this is another historical opportunity for the Pacific to show leadership on climate change is on this issue. And I've just urged all people who are with us on this session this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are, work with your political leaders, get them aware, get them on board, because ultimately it has to come from governments at the UN. So talk to your MP, talk to anyone who can influence the government to take a stand on this issue. Thank you.
Excellent. So I'd like to recap with saying that there's lots of great material here that we can take forward in our report to the PIF and also to the different leaders going forward. So thank you, Vinaka Vakalevu, Fatai, and Dhanyavad to all our speakers who have been here and shared this inspirational examples, and this Talanoa has been fantastic, especially sharing with everybody who's listening out there, 115 of you. This is really, really humbling that you've stayed with us for the whole conversation, and really with so much dedication. It's just beautiful and powerful to be united in this way. And this is another word that came out very strongly from all the speakers, that we need to show solidarity and be united in the effort that we are making right now. And I also want to acknowledge our members in Tuvalu, in Climate Action Network Tuvalu, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands, and Fiji, who have actually been setting up these amazing hubs and participating in full force, I must say, impressive, and hats off to all of you in all the Pacific Island nations, and also those who are actually linking in from outside the Pacific. Thank you so much for being with us. We are really honored to be with you today on this amazing topic, and we would make sure the reports go back to everybody who's been participating. And we have captured the points that have come on the chat. Don't hesitate to email the PICAN team if you have other points that have come up during this meeting that were not captured. We'll be more than happy to take that on board. And one more time in my, let's say, mother tongue, Dhanyavad, Shukriya, and Vinaka Vakalevu to everybody, and especially our excellent speakers. It's been an honor to share this space with you. Thank you. And thank you to all our participants and listeners.